Been planning for a while. I didn't want to lose it.
Yeah, Aronoff, the director of the Michael and Elaine Sterling Institute for Jewish Studies in Modern Israel. We're very, very honored to have Professor Alon Tal with us this morning, professor and Knesset member. Before I introduce him properly, I just want to remind those students who are on to please consider staying until after this lecture and discussion, because we're going to have an hour session for students that Professor Alon Tal will lead about internship opportunities in Israel. And he's extremely knowledgeable about so many opportunities relating to that environment, different NGOs, the government, issues related to gender equality, all kinds of issues. He can really be a lot of help to you in thinking of internship opportunities, and we have lots of scholarships for those internships for those students who are interested. Before we get started, I just wanted to announce a couple things that are coming up. So on Friday afternoon from 4 to 5 for those students who are either Jewish Studies minors or who would like to learn more about the minor, we're going to be from 4 to 5 outside behind Wells, behind the Starbucks of Wells, and we'll have faculty there, we'll have information there, we'll have current students there. It'll be kind of a fun gathering for you to learn more about it. Also, unfortunately, we've had some anti-Semitic incidents on campus this week, following kind of 80 or so incidents in the past few years. And of course, there were physical attacks against Jews across the country in May and June. So because of that, we want to kind of heighten attention to the education we're doing on anti-Semitism on campus. So on Friday from 12 to 1:30, also outside behind the Starbucks, we're having a discussion on our forthcoming book on contending with anti-Semitism in a rapidly changing political climate. Ariana Menzel is our assistant director at the Sterling Institute. You can contact her for PDFs of chapters if you're interested in joining that book discussion. And also on October 8th, we're having a symposium on anti-Semitism with 6 scholars from across the country who are going to talk about campus climate issues in regard to anti-Semitism, also past and current issues, how it informs white nationalism, and all kinds of those issues. So if you're ever interested, you can check out our website, and Ariana has also posted some information on that. But let's get to the exciting, interesting, very urgent topic for today. So Professor Alon Tal is familiar to many of you. He is now for the 7th time teaching at Michigan State University during a shortened fall semester at James Madison College. So he's taught all kinds of courses on global climate change, on environment, but also on Israeli politics, cultures, and society. He's an amazing asset. Students rave about Professor Tal. He brings an experience from both academia and as a practitioner. He's been an environmental activist his whole life. And he set up the the Israeli Environmental Defense Fund that he established. He established the Aravai Institute at Kibbutz Keturah, which is an amazing center that brings together Jordanians, Palestinians, and Israelis to look at common environmental challenges and ways of solving that. So our study abroad program, environmental study abroad program, when it visits the Aravai Institute for several days, and we've been just incredibly impressed by their work. Perhaps most importantly right now, Professor Alon Tal is a Knesset member for the Blue and White Party. He joined the government this summer, and he's been working extremely hard since 4:30 this morning Israeli time, and now it's 6 p.m. Israeli time when he's joining us. But he's working hard, of course, on global climate change, environmental issues, but also issues of religious pluralism, gender equality, keeping the door open to a two-state solution, and lots of good things. So we're focused on the environment today, but if a couple of people have other questions on these other issues, he'd be happy to answer those as well. He's written, he's not only been an activist and co-chair of the Green Party historically, but has written 11 books. And most recently, he co-edited Climate Change, Environment, and National Security, A New Front in 2021. but he has many, many books, including The Land is Full, Addressing Overpopulation in Israel in 2016, on forestation, on water issues that he co-wrote with Palestinian colleagues. So he's just, I always admire and I'm inspired by everything that Olam Tal does, but both academically and now in the government, he's really is doing a lot of positive change. And so we're thrilled to have you share your expertise with us, and also what you're doing in the government in terms of what the new Israeli government is doing to combat global, the urgency of global climate change. So please, thank you so much for joining us. For those of you, please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A, and when Professor Alan Tal is done, Knesset member Alan Tal, I will field those questions for you, and we can also try to unmute you and have you ask in person if you'd like, or you can write it in the Q&A. Thank you so much. Thank you, Alan Tal, for being with us today.
Well, thank you so much, Yael. Now that I'm appearing as a politician and not just as a professor, I wish I could take you with me as I go around the country and try to convince people to vote for my party, because I don't think I get as warm a reception from anybody as I get from people at Michigan State University, and of course you as head of the Sterling Institute. So thank you so much for having me yet again. Indeed, miracles happen every day in the Holy Land. And I woke up in June to discover that after trying several times to find a way into the Knesset, our parliament in Israel, things seem to have worked out. What we call the Norwegian law, which allows party members who are going to become ministers to resign and allow other people to come in, was implemented. And next thing I know, I woke up and took a leave of absence from Tel Aviv University, but was delighted and grateful to Michigan State, which has enabled me, given the health situation we have in the family, to teach my class in Zoom. And I assume that many of my MC scholars are on board here from our class, and I welcome you and thank you for coming. I'll be honest, I didn't actually have time to check how the football game came out yesterday, but I assume it was a winning effort. Maybe you can enable me, and hope that everybody's in good spirits this morning. I'm going to talk about some serious issues involving climate change. I think many of us saw recently that there was a new study published by the IPCC, the UN's International Panel on Climate Change, which said that we are trying very hard to prevent an increase of temperature of 1.5 degrees centigrade. And already since post-industrial times, it's gone up 1.2% worldwide. So there's very little time to stabilize the greenhouse gas concentrations in our atmosphere. There's very little time to really give future generations the kind of climatic stability which we've enjoyed. And I think that anybody who has, as we say in Hebrew, has eyes in their head and has read the news coming out of California and the wildfires there and the recent floodings and all of the warnings, which for decades now, I think the climate advocates have been concerned about, we realize that climate change is no longer the discouraging future visions of Al Gore. No, it's a new, it's the weather reports that we look at every day, and it's something which we have to address now. And so what I'm going to talk today about the Middle East in this context, and Israel in particular. With your permission, I will move to a PowerPoint. I think I'll talk for about 25 minutes if I keep the pace up as it should, and then hopefully I'll be sufficiently provocative to elicit questions. I'm not sure who's out there, but before I do, I just want to shout out if I heard that my friend Michael Sterling and Elaine Sterling might be on board tonight, and I regret that we were supposed to celebrate my Knesset membership by coming over, but I take a rain check, and hopefully by the end of the year, things will change and health restrictions will open up and things will be better. So here we go. I hope we can all see the PowerPoint, and let's get started. I want to make 8 points in talking about this, but before I do, I just want to say that we did put out a book this year, February 2021, with the Israel National Institute for Security Studies, which is the big think tank in Tel Aviv where all the ex-generals go when they are done, but they still have brain power to think about the future. And it was a very important moment, I thought, for the organization or for the security establishment, for the first time to recognize climate change as a security challenge for Israel. We often talk about the climate crisis now, not so much the climate situation. And I believe the Middle East, way before the rest of the world, it has already reached crisis stages, and it has security implications when you only look at the really terrible situation that's ensued over the last several years in Syria to see just how a few years of climate-induced drought can lead to the implosion of an entire society. And we're looking at those kind of stabilizing effects all around our region and Israel in particular. So those are things that that was one of the co-editors in this book in the chapter that I wrote about, talked about. So my first point, if I might, is that the Middle East is an increasingly hot region. Here you see Israel's new best friend in the region, the United Arab Emirates. And I visited there even before we had the Abraham agreements. And it was, in the middle, they made it with this big international conference in October. So it would be nice and cool. And it was a breezy 105 degrees, 106 degrees. It's awfully hot there and regularly crosses 50 degrees Celsius, which I think is around 125 degrees, 120 degrees. And we see all around our region record temperatures, which are really making things as seemingly insignificant as owning an air conditioner, the difference between life and death. Here's headlines from the Washington Post, and the photo that they showed when Baghdad reached this 125 degree temperature. I think Death Valley, California is competing for the hottest place on earth, but we see records breaking all across the region. And in fact, if we just get a sense of just how hot it is in this region, you may remember the old timers amongst you in 2003, there was a heat wave in Paris and it reached 40 degrees, which I think is about 105 degrees in Fahrenheit terms, and 1,500 people died because Europe was never thought they would have to deal with those kinds of temperatures and didn't really have the air conditioning infrastructure to protect people. Well, think about the fact that every year now, the Emirates goes over 50. In Egypt, we see people dying of heat waves who are in high buildings. When the heat comes, old people literally just can't get down the steps and end up cooking in there. And Israel is no exception. We had our first 50 degree weather in Sodom. It's not just a place in the Bible where Abraham tried to stop God's destruction in Genesis, but it's a real place, and it's extremely hot in the summer, and in July across that. So these are temperatures which are way above anything that we can accept. There's I was reading an article in The Economist about humidity, which has an impact on it. But when you're in a place like Tel Aviv, which has high humidity, you really can't do exercise after it crosses 35 degrees, which is somewhere maybe 90 degrees, because then if you're that kind of humidity, you're not going to be able to cool yourself, and you'll have heat stroke, and that's seeing with all kinds of football teams, players are getting sick and endangering their lives and the like. So that's the point I want to make, is that Israel, just like much of the Middle East, is a climate change hotspot. In other words, we have all the symptoms we're supposed to have. We just have it worse than other places and in greater dosages. So I mentioned that maybe the global average has increased about a degree over the last 40 years. In Israel, we've seen a 2-degree increase in temperature since 1970. That's a half a degree Celsius every decade. Now, this matters in months like, July, August, and even now in September. Those 2 degrees, the difference between having, say, an 85 and 90 degree day is a big difference. And what's most, of course, disconcerting, it doesn't stop there. There's nothing that says that this rapid increase, which is really dwarfs the global averages, will not increase. And the same, by the way, is true of the problem of coastlines and rising sea level. The Mediterranean has, we now think of maybe even 10 millimeters a year, and that's compared to the world average of 3 millimeter. So for those of you who are familiar with Tel Aviv geography, the Yarkon Street seems like a pretty lucrative street now with all the hotels and the chic restaurants. But if you look to the future, you may not want to invest there, because if we keep going up at this rate, eventually it'll be underwater. And in fact, we've seen the frequency and the ferocity of storms have hit the country in a way that nobody was prepared for it. Now, for the last 3 winters, this is the city of Nahariya, but we know that there's been all kinds of floods every year in South Tel Aviv. We've had massive and deadly fires every year. This is from the recent one in Jerusalem, where the Jerusalem Hills lost about 10,000 dunams or 2,500 acres of really gorgeous and really important forest land, woodlands that was very painstakingly planted and coaxed into existence, and then it was taken care of, and it was probably an act of arson, but it didn't, the arson has always been going on, but it never had the kind of dry conditions that we have. So even a few weeks ago, there was no rain, and after a very, very long summer and the dry conditions produced a perfect storm for that. Of course, we know that the region is filled with all kinds of challenges with regard to water. And when you have a situation of climate change, and this is my second point, it means that water scarcity is all of a sudden a challenge that it never was in the past. And I immediately give the case of Jordan, who's our neighbor to the east of Israel, and whose stability is extremely important. The king of Jordan, King Abdullah, is a moderate. His country has not had the same kind of extreme Islamic tendencies. We've managed to get along with differences. In fact, now that we have a new government, I'm delighted that Prime Minister Bennett and Defense Minister Gantz have met with the king, and we're going back to the more harmonious days. But they are in bad shape. Here you see a picture of the Zatari refugee camp with the Syrian refugees I described, about 1.7 million Syrians, who's part of the pathology of the warfare and the civil war, fled into Jordan. Many others flew to Lebanon, and they all have water footprints. They all drink water, so much so that there has been unrest in the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. Here's a demonstration from 2 summers ago where people said, we're not getting enough water up there near Irbid in the north because the allocations were cut because they had to give water to 1.7 million people. We know that the Dead Sea is disappearing. This is one of the big concerns we have. You can see how it used to look in 1960. Now it looks something like this, where it's now separated, but we're looking at what it's going to be in 2050. And one of the reasons why is because the Jordan River is not flowing almost at all. And if it did flow, the Jordanians would take the water and bring it to Amman, because people didn't have water. Maybe they get water somewhere on the order of 8 to 15 hours a week. It's very, very modest there. And so we see all around the region. Here's some stuff from the Kinneret. It was a study that we did looking at the rainfall that's happened over the years. And, you know, there are variations and variability, but you can see where the regression analysis took us in terms of the general trends. And the subsequent years became even lower. And here you can see this is the tributaries, the different so-called headwaters of the Jordan, the Dan River, and they're all on a downward incline, okay? And that means that the water levels in the Kinneret, which is Israel's only freshwater lake, and really the only, I think it's the lowest lake in the world, but maybe the most important freshwater lake in the region in terms of serving as a reservoir, it reached its lowest levels in recorded history. A couple years ago now, thank heavens we had a couple of years of reasonable rainfall, and they basically stopped pumping water out of our national reservoir, the Sea of Galilee, or Kinneret as we called it, but we have to be concerned about this, very concerned. When you have a situation where your rainfall is dropping, then you also need to know that salinity is going to go up, because the water disappears, the salt stays in the lake, and when the salt goes up, that means that the ecosystems start to be affected negatively. The water that you wanted to drink is not as good for irrigation. And we see this steady increase in salinity. It's also a climate change related problem. So these are some of the issues that we're dealing with in terms of water. And you could say that the climate change offers new opportunities for the region. So here you have a picture of one of Israel's 5 major desalination plants. For almost 20 years now, Israel's been taking water from the sea, putting it through these reverse osmosis membranes, with using considerable energy to do so, but providing about 80% of the country's drinking water. Here you can see the different facilities as they moved up, and now a new one is being built in the northern coast with a different kind of objective, although it will provide some drinking water. Mostly it's going to provide water for the Sea of Galilee, which is all of a sudden changing its function. Here you can see the infrastructure. This massive pipe is water, which is pumped from the Sea of Galilee, from the Kinneret, to Jordan as part of the peace agreement from some 25 years ago. And this amount of water is not enough. And Jordan has said, we'll take any water you can have, and we'll even start paying for it. And the agreement, we're going to give them the most of the water for free, but they're happy to pay for it because they need water, and Israel can produce it cheaper than anybody else in the world. So we're creating for the first time is a new infrastructure. This is one idea, which would be the so-called a Dead Canal, which would take water up there and create a desalination plant into Jordan, provide water that way. And the other thing that has been done, and this is, I think, the largest climate change adaptation project in the entire Middle East, is where at the time, the Minister of Energy and Water, Yuval Steinitz, he's a Likud minister, so I'm happy to report he's a friend of mine, but I'm glad that he's in the opposition. Now he's no longer a minister. We have another minister, she's terrific, from the Yesh Atid party, has the same job. But when he was at the job, he did something very bold. He said, we are going to take the Sea of Galilee and return it to its historic role as a reservoir, because we'd stopped pumping water. But how can we do that? Because we know that the rainfall is dropping. So he made what he called reverse national water carry. In the past, we used to take water out of the national reservoir in the Canaanite and pump it down south to the parched southlands. Now the reservoir doesn't have to give, so we're going to take water from the sea, desalinate it, and send it over to the Canaanite, where it will sit there until we can send extra quantities to Jordan. Here you can see the pipe, which is being laid. I think this is already almost a year old, so this has already been covered, but we're building the infrastructure so that the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, can provide the freshwater lake of the Canaanite with water. And this is sort of a climate change adaptation project, because unfortunately, the historic drainage into the Canaanite watershed and the Jordan River watershed is going down, and it's not going to change. And it takes just a thimbleful of foresight to see that it's going to have to do that. So although historically Jesus walked on natural waters, today, if you look to the future, he'll be maybe walking on desalinated water. My fourth point is that the Middle East is an interesting place, a diverse place when it comes to looking at the actual performance of the different countries with regard to their carbon footprints, how much emissions they're leaving. Now I've been talking about the effects. I want to talk about how we're doing. And some of the countries have some of the highest carbon footprints in the world. These, of course, are the oil-producing countries around the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Oman, United Arab Emirates, unbelievable quantities of carbon per person. But the world champion is Kuwait. And you can see that it's linked very much to the amount of oil that they're produced. Israel also has a relatively high carbon footprint, but that is maybe changing. Here's a picture of Tamar Zandberg, and I apologize to her. We exchanged messages today because it's not a flattering picture. I think she's much nicer looking than that picture, but she's quite a brilliant young minister from the Meretz party. And she took the job of Minister of Environment. And I had not known her. She's a big human rights activist and a very thoughtful and sometimes vituperative politician. I didn't know she was passionate about the environment. When she took the job, I said, Tamar, I was glad to see you Minister of Environment. Why'd you take it? She said, didn't you know, I used to teach a course in environmental policy. In fact, I used your book about pollution in the promised land as my textbook. And I said, I'm shocked. I thought that the only person who used that as a textbook was Eric Aronoff. And so I want to thank her and Eric for using that book. But we have a woman who came into the job, obviously having read important books, but being very passionate about it. And she pushed our government for the first time to set real climate change targets. In other words, emission reduction targets, so that we should have 85% reduction in emissions by 2050. 2050 is a long way away. That's 29 years away. And what we really need to worry about is what's going to happen by 2030, because climate scientists tell us we have 10 years to stabilize the environment. Otherwise, we're going to cross that 2-degree threshold and we're going to have climate chaos. So what I'm trying to do recently in the Knesset is really try to find ways that we can push ourselves to be much more ambitious in the short term. In the long term, I'm reasonably satisfied with the goals the government has set. Her original plan, of course, was to have those kind of tough goals, but there were other realists in the cabinet which sort of cooled her tool there and slowed things down. But I think we in the parliament need to give her more support. But this is the decision that we got in the government in July 2021. And you can see that we're talking about long-term reductions in this. Give you the color scheme. The orange is the amount of emissions coming from industry. The blue is what we could expect from transportation. Notice by 2050, we expect an entirely electric transportation system, which will be based on renewables. And this gray is the electricity footprint, which will be dropping. And I should be emphasizing this is as the country expects to almost double its population over that period of time. So this is, if we can make this objective, we should be very proud of ourselves. And now I bring myself to maybe the next point that I wanted to discuss, which is that when we look at the issue of Israel's performance in climate change, we have to think about population. This is an issue I've talked about before at MSU forums, and my students all have to suffer the book, The Land is Full, which is my diatribe about overpopulation in Israel. But you can see the world, what's going on. As the world population increased, so did CO2 emissions. And there hasn't been any country that has population continues to rise geometrically, which has succeeded in reducing its emissions significantly, Israel being no exception. Just to give you some ideas about this, but before I do, let's remember that when in 2017, a very important article came out in Environmental Research Letters, which asks a simple question: what can I do to reduce my carbon footprint? And we can do a lot of things. You could upgrade your light bulbs. You can recycle or hang out your clothes to dry, or give up your dry altogether. You can switch to an electric car. You can use renewable energy, drive a bike, have one fewer child, though. It's about 50 times more than everything. So that's something which we need to think about in Israel for sure, which is a population growing at 2% a year, that you're basically running on a treadmill. As you try to cut back on your emissions, there's more and more people, and everybody who's born, wherever they are in the world, is born with a certain, carbon footprint. That's your birthright to use energy. And so we need to think about the fact that one of the pillars of sustainability has to be stability, including demographic stability. Now, here is something sort of to emphasize this point. When I think about the world, take a look what happened when the Climate Change Convention was, Madeline, I see your hand, and we will get the questions in about 5 minutes. Okay, I'm almost at the closing sections of the talk, but I want to make this point. When the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, was enacted around 1992, you can see the blue line. The wealthy countries of the OECD dominated the emissions profile. The United States at those days was the biggest #1 emissions in the world. China and India were far behind. That has changed. And you can see this was by 2014. Now they're way off the mark. The wealthier countries are actually reducing their carbon footprint, cutting back on their emissions. But developing countries, and some could say with some justification, are increasing theirs because their per capita footprints are certainly smaller than the West. But if the developing countries continue to increase their emissions that way, it won't matter. We're all going to cook together, and they'll suffer first. The climate refugees are mostly from developing countries, and the worst impacts, even though it may not be fair in terms of climate justice, are there. So we all have to work together, and that's what Paris was about. Just create Paris, I'm talking about the 2015 UN convention, which convened there and really made for the first time goals. And President Obama did an amazing job of bringing the world leaders together. And John Kerry was his, I would say, hyperactive Secretary of State. I say that with the fondest of greatest of admiration, by getting so many countries to submit action plans and bringing China and India on board. Well, let's take a look about population in the region. Look what's happened in Jordan. Its population has grown since it was established in 1949, or 48 actually. It was about 500,000 people, so its population has increased 20-fold. And lo and behold, look, in the same way its population is going up, so it's greenhouse gas emissions. Same is true for Egypt, excuse me. Egypt, we see about 2 million more people every single year, and lo and behold, their CO2 is going up. Israel's the same way. We have not as much increase in terms of per capita, but overall increase has gone up. And of course, we all know that Israel has a very high birth rate, over 3 children per family, the highest in the OECD by a lot. So this is an issue which, if we really want to be seriously talking about climate change, we can't ignore it. It's something which is unpopular. I was warned by many people not to mention this issue because it's so culturally sensitive when I get to the Knesset. But I said, if I taught a course at Michigan State about overpopulation and sustainability and preached the gospel of stability, then I certainly can't back off now that I'm a politician. No, we have to speak the truth. And so I am talking about this issue, doing what I can to empower women in particular to help them in this issue. 7th point I want to make, and we're getting close to the end, is that Israeli society is waking up, and what you see before you is a photograph of the, I think in Hebrew I would call it the youth strike for the future, the child march. And I'm talking about thousands of Israeli high school kids who are literally inspired by the inimitable Greta Thunberg, I think she's still a teenager, the Swedish teenager who said no, spoke truth to power, and has been shaming us adults for some time that we just have to be more serious about this issue, that we are forfeiting our children's future. And kids in Israel are getting it, are getting mad. And this is a demonstration that I went to, and they're happening all the time. They're showing up and they could walk in the Knesset. You see 15, 16-year-old kids saying, member of Knesset talk, can I talk to you? And I say, well, we got this law. And I say, but it's not enough. You know it's not enough. And they're really giving us a kick in the pants to do more. Here you can see Israel has an annual climate march, which because of COVID restrictions has not taken place for 2 years, but has started to show, I think the last one, 50,000 people showed up. It's quite an effect. Here you have a picture of an interesting meeting. This is 6 of the 7 of us. Our government is formed by a coalition of 7 different political parties. And what you have here is in each political party, we identified a environmental champion who is interested in the environment and climate. So this is me, that you can't see with the mask on, but that would be me. I think you can wear the same shirt I'm wearing now. And this is Yorai, my good friend Yorai Lahab from Yesh Atid, and this is Edith Silman from Yamina, the right-wing party that Prime Minister Bennett comes from. And this is Mossi Raz from Meretz, a true environmental champion, Ram Sheffer. And for Laban Shur, we have party activists, and we said, let's all work together. In 4 years, I hope there'll be elections, not before then, and we'll compete about who is the most green party and who gets the green votes in Israel. But until that time, let's work together because we have common goals. And I'm so delighted to be working with such generous colleagues, and everybody's on board, and we're working together. In fact, just today I saw Mossi in the Interior and Environment Committee, and we are going to divvy up the renewable energy legislation between the 2 of us. And that's the kind of cooperation and leadership that I hope we can provide in the parliament, which will lead Israel to a better place in terms of our climate performance. Because it's getting serious. Just this week, this is on Yom Kippur, which we just finished out on Thursday, I think. We had the end of a week-long strike by Michal Deutsch, this nice woman here. She's an undergraduate in Israel studying law. We could study law in undergraduate, Israel and environmental science. She's 26 years old, and she said, nobody's taking climate seriously. And she sat down in front of the president of Israel's house and started a hunger strike. And of course, the city of Jerusalem tried to remove her, and we had to intervene, but we did intervene. And I'm in touch with her. Hopefully she's going to come as a volunteer and work at our office. But this gives the sense of the kind of commitment that we're seeing for the first time about an environmental issue. Israeli young people are passionate, and they're pushing us. So you can see, for example, something I'm hopeful for that Israel could lead the world is agrovoltaics. We know that we need to grow more food locally because anytime you import food, the carbon footprint just goes through the roof. But we have all this open space. Can we find a way to use shading in creative ways? And there's been a lot of research. I think agrovoltaic is going to be one way that Israel's going to find a way to move away from any kind of fossil fuels to this. And to my last slide, which is that the last thing that matters, youth matters, but population matters, but Biden matters. And I want to sort of tell a quick story here. About 15 years ago, I was chair of an umbrella organization called Life and Environment. And this was an organization of 110 environmental groups. And when the new Minister of Environment at the time, he was Likudnik, named Tzachi Negbi, was appointed Minister of Environment, he had a self-aggrandizing session where he invited 200 environmental activists to some big hotel room and had 4 or 5 environmental leaders offer him a blessing to wish him good luck. And so I got up and I said, well, I've been in Israel long enough to have a little bit of chutzpah. I'm not giving you a blessing. I'll tell you 10 things I would do if I was the minister. And the third one was I would adopt a voluntary carbon ceiling. Israel at the time was defined as a developing country and didn't have to do anything for climate change. But I said, it's unthinkable that the Jewish state would not have a model position with regard to its commitment to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And I went on. Anyway, 2 days later, I was in a bank talking to my banker, who was complaining that once again I was in overdraft, which I was. And all of a sudden my phone rings. I don't recognize the number. I answer. He said, hello, and this is Tzachi Negbi, the Minister of Environment. So I tell the banker there, oh, sorry, I got to talk to the minister. He said, yeah, you just don't want to deal with your bank overdraft. But it was the minister. And he said, here's the thing, Alon. I heard what you said, and I kind of agreed with you about the carbon ceiling adopting. But I checked, the United States never adopted and never ratified the Kyoto Protocol for the Climate Change Convention. I said, well, yeah, it's a Republican Senate, whatever. He said, well, we can't be more vigilant to the Americans. They set the pace for us environmentally. So when you get the Americans on board, I'm on board, but until then, we're not doing much. And that's my last point here, is that America matters. It matters in the world. And when Donald Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord in Israel, I was very proud in Israel that we did not. But the whole world had a sense that, oh my gosh, the leader of the climate battles, which was the US and the architect of the Paris Agreement, has abdicated. Who's going to lead us now? And when President Joe Biden came back in, all of us, and you could see him here talking with our Prime Minister Bennett and Prime Minister Bennett's recent visit to Washington, he came with a program that says, look, by 2035, we're going to have 100% renewable energy in Israel. And that gives me the moral basis to come in and say, what is this 30% Israeli new renewables by 2030? Look at America. We got to meet the Biden standard. And I hope we do. And I'm very hopeful that with this new wind blowing and the convening of all the nations in the world once again in Glasgow, Scotland in November, we'll all be able to see a significant step forward beyond the Paris objectives, which are nice, but are not enough to give the future generations the kind of future we all want to give them. So I believe we can do it. I believe that climate change is a human-created problem, and it's one that we can also solve. So I went a little over my time, but certainly we have time for questions and answers. So Yael, it's back to you.
Okay. Thank you for a whirlwind tour of the problems globally, regionally, in Israel, all the different facets that need to be addressed, and also ending kind of with trying to inspire us also through the youth, but also through what Biden and others are at least trying to do for the medium to long term, as you suggest. Let's first, I'll first field questions that deal directly with Alon Tal's lecture on the environment, and then we might go to other issues since he's a Knesset member, but let's first deal with those. I think that, Alon, you first saw, I see that there's a question from Daniel Quintana. There's also a question initially that you saw for someone with a raised hand, Madeline. Right, so I don't know if Madeline, you want to ask first, and then Daniel, and I think Ariana can unmute you when you ask your question.
Yeah, I want to tell my students in the Israel cultural and history that there's a common word in Hebrew which they need to know, and it's called protexia. Protexia means you know somebody in high places. So in this lecture, if you, Madeline, if you're in my in class about Israel, you have protexia, you have connections with the speaker, so we're going to let you in first.
Excuse me, I think that must have been in error, if that's me, Madeline.
I had another Maddie who's there, but that's here's Madeline Webb, I think. Anyway, whatever, we'll find you. It's okay, we got room for both Madelines. Go ahead.
This is a lot of pressure to say that I misclicked. And they cut my misclick almost instantaneously, so I'm embarrassed to say I have no questions, though I greatly enjoyed the lecture.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Madeline. We'll see you in class on Monday, tomorrow. We'll see.
Daniel, do you want to go? I don't know, Ariana, if you can unmute Daniel. Or, yeah.
Great, can you hear me?
Can't see you, but I can hear you. Open your camera.
Great. Thanks for the lecture. I really appreciated it. It's great to see what Israel is doing. It sounds like there's some really successful and important desalination projects that are happening that I think can be exported around the world as temperature rises. So that's great to see, and I think that's exciting technology. I was kind of going to approach the sort of suggestion about population. I know this is kind of, like you were saying, a touchy subject, and so I'm kind of curious, I guess, why focus on population as it sort of increases the demand for energy, as opposed to thinking more about the supply of that energy, because I know at least that, we could conceivably electrify all appliances, or, electrify our energy consumption and then supply that electricity with renewable energy. I think that's entirely possible within the next 10, 15 years. And so I'm kind of curious, I guess, then why focus on population control as a policy outcome, as opposed to a transition to more renewable energy in Israel. And then I guess to further that question, what are the efforts in Israel at the moment for that renewable energy transition, if there is any?
Well, thanks so much, Daniel. I think you raised the classic, so-called dilemma where people say, you know what, the problem of sustainability, it's not overpopulation, it's consumption. And others say, no, it's not consumption, it's overpopulation. And this sort of a tit for tat, I don't think it really reflects the reality. The truth of the matter is you're absolutely right. Energy consumption is critical. We won't solve the problem. And overpopulation is critical. I look at this sort of thing as I look at the cumulative footprint, if we could think of it as a rectangle. I'm not sure which side of the rectangle is longer in this equation. Is it the consumption and the energy consumption, or is it the population? I just know that ultimately it doesn't matter which side is longer because the volume of the rectangle stays the same. So it really needs a false dilemma in my mind. We need to deal with both. I mean, everybody who's born is going to want to fly on an airplane. Will we have hydrogen airplanes in 8-9 years? I hope so, but I don't know for sure. And if not, the point is that when you have carbon dioxide staying in the atmosphere 200 to 300 years at a shot, we really can't afford to have more and more people producing more and more things, even if we can cut back their emissions per capita, which I assume we will be doing, and we've started to do in the Western worlds. So my response would be, you're right. Israel can and should do much, much more in terms of moving its energy profile into renewable sectors. But let's remember something very thoughtful that Bill Gates wrote in his 2021 book, excellent and highly recommended book, addressing the climate crisis, or how to avoid a climate crisis, he calls the book. And he points out that even if we got all the energy equations right, in terms of the electricity is only 28% of the global footprint of carbon. So you have everything else, industries 35%, you've got transportation, you've got eating meat, there's all kinds of other things. In Israel, electricity is a little bit more, it's about 38, 39%, but it's coming down. And I believe that even after we're done moving to a fully renewable economy, we'll still have many, many challenges. For example, Israel's one large cement plant, the Nesher plant, not too far from my house in Ramla. It produces 4% of the greenhouse gas of the country, one factory, because we really don't know yet how to solve the problem of producing cement or steel, for that matter, without producing a prodigious carbon footprint. So we need to do technological improvement. I think you're right in terms of energy. The pricing is already so in favor of renewable energies. If you're in a place that has space for maybe more space, you can take in wind energy. Certainly Israel, we could use our roofs and maybe even the seashore to start bringing in more solar. But the point is we could do so much more in terms of energy. And I'm proud to say that of the 5 laws that I'm allowed to submit this particular session, I think the 5th one will be requiring all public buildings to have on their rooftops solar photovoltaic panels. We did that in the 1970s with passive solar heating for hot water. And immediately the collective energy demand dropped about 3 to 4%. We would drop a lot more if we started making every house, every new building with solar panels. I don't know why it is when I drive into the MSU campus and I see the wonderful solar panels over there, that parking lot. How is that in Israel, which really has sun, unlike East Lansing, which you think you have sun, but believe me, you don't have like sun like we have in the Middle East. How can we not be doing that? So I think you're right that Israel can be doing much more. And I think we need to set much tougher standards and incentives to do that. That'll be this question.
Thank you. Okay,
great. We have a question from Professor Mark Bernstein in terms of the overpopulation question. Of course, we all know that it's concentrated sometimes in particular, groups, whether it be Haredi or some Bedouin populations and others. If you can address that, that would be great. And then I see 2 people with their hands up, and we'll go in that order: Abraham Yum and then Naya Todd. So after we're done addressing that, maybe Ariana, if you can unmute them. Thanks so much.
Okay, well, those are 2 of my champion students there from my class. So I'll make a quick answer for Mark, and then we'll let Abraham and Naya come over. Naya, I owe her a link to the best Asian restaurant in the Jerusalem Hills, which is also called Naya. I promised her in our last class. Anyway, Mark, you're right. There is a problem of overpopulation in Israel, but if you really distill it down to the ethnic its components, because Israel is indeed a very ethnically diverse place. Two populations particularly have large families. One is the ultra-Orthodox, where they average about 7 children per family. And one is the Bedouin population, which, depending, you can break that up. It's about an average of 5.2, 5.3. It's coming down, but still is very high by international levels. And the great challenge as an advocate for this issue, and I've been doing this for about 4 or 5 years, how do I do this without coming off as a virulently anti-ultra-Orthodox or anti-Bedouin person? Because to me, it has absolutely nothing to do with their culture. It's just common sense that if they continue to produce so many children, first of all, they're going to never get out of the poverty traps. And these are the 2 most poor groups in Israel. But eventually, Israel will find itself in with the demographic momentum, which is going to carry us into levels where the carrying capacity is really going to be exceeded. And we did a major study on this issue. So I think that public policy is critical. I'm hopeful that this government, which for the first time doesn't have ultra-Orthodox representation in it, the ultra-Orthodox parties chose to go into opposition with Bibi Netanyahu. This gives us a chance to create incentives which will truly empower women, because no society has ever really stabilized population without giving women some sort of a horizon professionally, personally, beyond being a mother. And I think the very low glass ceiling that we see both in the Bedouin community, where 70% of the girls in the South get married, not of their own volition, but sort of enforced, coerced marriages, and the very low ceiling for the professional opportunities in the ultra-Orthodox community, where women would not be in medical school, would probably not be lawyers or scientists or whatever. So these are things we need to change. And I think if we can do that, I think we have the ability to offer those incentives. I think the populations themselves want to be liberated a little bit from the present cultural constraints. And of course, everything has to be fully voluntary, consensual. We don't want to be in a China where we start telling people how many kids to have, but I think we can create incentives which will create conditions to lead to stability. So that's I've wrote a couple chapters about that in my book, but I have to leave it at that. Abraham, can you unmute? Maybe offer yours?
Yes. Hello, Professor.
Hi, how you doing? Good to see you again.
Good. Yes.
Camera. Open your camera if you'd be so kind.
I don't see the option here, but I don't. Oh, there we go.
If not, we can just take the question. I'll imagine your smile and here you are. Good to see you.
Hi, Professor. So you kind of just briefly touched upon it, but I just had a question on so what's the political environment in terms of climate change? Because I know in the U.S. climate change has been a very political issue with people. A lot of the people have been denying climate change and stuff. So just from your experience of you being there in Israel, what is the climate of people's opinions on climate change, and also what's the political standpoint on climate change in Israel as well?
Abram, that's a fantastic question. And I have to go back a little bit in history to make my point. When I was in graduate school, I spent my summers at US EPA as sort of a consultant type. At the time, there was a Republican administration. George Bush, the father of, I think that George H. Bush was the president. And the administrator of the US EPA was a guy named Lee Thomas, and he was fantastic. He was passionate, he was smart, he was a great manager. It was a totally environmental organization. And I remember coming back to the States, 15, 20 years later and said, what happened? The most pro-environmental president was Richard Nixon, a Republican. And now all of a sudden you have this tragic polarization in the United States between Republicans and Democrats, which will be bridged over time in science-based, evidence-based policies. But in Israel, thank heavens we don't have that. Right and left are no less divided, angry, rivals as they are in the States. I don't think that you could say that the Likud and the other parties are in any degree more civil to each other. But on the environment, we can agree. And in fact, when I established we call it lobby, but putting together there, I managed to get the previous Minister of Environment, a gifted young, middle-aged woman, Gila Gamliel, who was the previous minister, and we agree about everything. And I think she reflects the reality is that you can find passionate environments amongst ultra-Orthodox religious Jews, and Arabs are there. And indeed, the picture I showed you of our factions, we have a couple of real right-wing parties, and they have environmental champions too. So one of the problems, thank heavens, we don't have to to solve in Israel is bridging the political ideological gap on the environmental issues. We've got to raise awareness and we've got to make more investment, and we have to convince people that climate change is as much of a crisis as, say, the tensions with the Gaza Strip or with Iran. But on the whole, I think we have a good chance of doing that, because all Israelis recognize that we have a responsibility to protect this precious land of Israel.
Thank you, Professor.
Naya, you're on.
Okay, oops. Sorry.
Naya, I don't hear you. I'm having some trouble hearing you.
Sorry about that. I got a random notification. Hello. Sorry, my voice is a little hoarse. But this kind of builds on Abraham's question a little bit. I am not super educated on Israel and I guess the environment either, which is why I'm taking your class. But so you mentioned that basically Israel is denoted as like a developing country, and so they didn't have to follow certain climate rules, correct? So
I did say that. I didn't say it with pride. I think it was one of the more shameful chapters in Israel's environmental history. But yes, we did opt for the least, the path of least resistance, so to speak, in terms of international rules.
okay, so yeah, based on that, my question is, I noticed you said when you met, I believe, with the Prime Minister, that if the United States was not on board with like a specific climate act, since they are the leaders of that Israel wouldn't do the same. But I noticed, like, throughout the presentation, you also talked a lot about the youth being very involved in the environmental crisis and pushing the adults and politicians to take a stand. So do you think with those youths coming of age and like everyone, I think as you answered with Abraham's question, agreeing on the fact that the environmental crisis is such a big thing, that Israel could possibly become like a forefront leader with everything that they're doing with like creating clean water and different things like that?
Well, I think that's exactly what we hoped for. We're trying to package the Israeli climate policy on some sort of an economic self-interest. And if we had the foresight to really invest in, electricity storage, if the sun doesn't shine 24 hours a day, you got to store it. And there's some really neat technologies coming out of Israel. And we are the startup nation, and we'll have a class about that soon. And if this is the kind of thing, if clean tech and clean energy could be part of the Israeli economic identity, I think we could do much, much better. It is also my hope, and again, this is somebody who's a green candidate within a centrist party. So to the extent that people make the environment their number one priority in elections, I have great interest in that. And now, in the last time they did a survey, about 200,000 Israelis from the center left, which is about half the country, said that the environmental positions of a party would be a factor in picking them. They're not the only one, but so if we can say, listen, you want to vote for my party, and because we are going to really deliver a much more serious climate package, and we have more environmental integrity than our competing parties do. If we can make that case, then we'll have more seats in the Knesset. I'll get in, I'll move up in the party. People appreciate my contribution. So I'm very interested in changing the political calculus, and I'm basing it on the youth. You get the right to vote in local elections in Israel age 17, in the national elections at age 18. And I think that the same people who are lying in the streets and stopping traffic because they said, stop and think about climate change, are the same people that might say, you know what, we're going to vote for this. And you know what, I hope we all make that. I'd like to see all the parties competing to who can have the greenest candidates out there, because I think it is an important one. But I didn't want to make a misconception. I think that there has been a significant change in American environmental policy. John Kerry, who I said was the hero of Paris, is back for another round, and he's pushing the whole international community again with the support of President Biden. So with that, I think that America reassumes its leadership, and Israel really looks to America for leadership. It's our closest ally on the planet. And if America says, we think this is the way you should be behaving, by heaven, I think that our government will say, okay, America is pushing us, and they seem to. So there is a history of American self-righteousness on many issues, human rights, whatever, but the environment is one of them. And it is very, very heartwarming to see America reclaiming its identity as a world environmental leader. it's great for me as somebody who's happy to follow that one.
I think Caitlin, in terms of the raised hands, is next. Yeah.
Hey, Caitlin, good to see you. Yeah, I think we need to let her unmute. There you are. Just unmute.
Hi.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too. My question is about the rest of the community in the Middle East and how you believe that communication and working together with Jordan or Egypt or the United Arab Emirates is an important part of reducing emissions and just going towards a greener future in the area.
That is critically important. Israel's a teeny country, ecologically no bigger than a postage stamp, the size of New Jersey. So especially as our population rises, there's great concern that if we provide only our own solar energy, there will be no more open spaces. It will take away very important historic vistas, places with ecological significance, historic, religious significance. However, our neighbors have a lot of land and most of it is kind of empty desert. You don't want to say deserts are empty because they have their own ecosystems. But the truth of the matter is, as you know from our discussions about the partition plan and what happened after the mandate, is that Jordan came out with 66,000 square kilometers of land in Israel with only 22,000. They got a lot of land in Jordan and most of it is desert. And so one of the environmental organizations in Israel, which until I joined the Knesset, I had to resign from their board, but I was one of the founders, called EcoPeace, has a plan. They have offices in Amman, Jordan, in Ramallah in Palestine, and in Tel Aviv. And they have a notion which they call the water energy nexus, or the green-blue deal, or the blue-green deal, green-blue-green deal. But anyway, but the point is they said, let's each country use its advantages. Jordan will make copious quantities of solar energy. They have the space for it. They have the technology. They will export that electricity to Israel. And what do they get in return? Water. We'll take their energy, desalinize the water, because Jordan's access to the sea is far away. It's down in Aqaba. It's very expensive to pump the water up to Amman, but it's much cheaper. And we have the infrastructure, like I showed you already, in the Sea of Galilee, in the Lake Canaanite. So this idea would be that rather than cooperation being maybe Israel tends to give, no, this is a real reciprocity, because we need that clean energy. And the same could be true for Egypt, which has huge amounts of land, which is basically not being utilized. And there's lots of areas that can be done. The United Arab Emirates, our new buddies, they have also land mass about 4 times that of our country. So we can really hopefully take advantage of the space that they have. That's just one area in climate change that we could work together. Afforestation, carbon sequestration, and most models of fighting climate change, bringing carbon from the atmosphere via into the the roots and eventually the soil through via trees is important. Well, 97% roughly of the natural vegetation in historic Palestine was destroyed by this continuous litany of conquerors. I think we talked about in the second lecture a bit about, I showed some aerial photographs of what happened. Well, we have a pretty good record now of afforestation in Israel. We've made mistakes, but we're learning about that. And if you really have insomnia problems, I wrote a whole book about it if you want to know. But the point is that we could really share that experience and our ability to plant trees at unbelievably modest levels of rainfall, 250 millimeters and less of rainfall is unbelievable. Nobody in the world can grow trees there. And share that, and let's all start bringing vegetation, trees back to the Middle East. So that's just kind of 2 things where, yes, cooperation should be, but and of course you get the real benefit, because what's the scarcest resource in the Middle East? It's not just water, it's trust. And so if we could do these sort of real cooperative ventures, hopefully all of our, but that's something you should take away for our negotiation simulation at the end of class if you're on that. But good question. Thank you, Caitlin.
Thank you.
Okay, feel free to raise hands and add more questions to the Q&A. Before I take a couple questions for the Q&A, I'll ask a quick question in terms of your own top 3 priorities in the Knesset alone, in terms of the environment, how, if you get more specific on how you're, if you can, pushing certain things within the government, within the Knesset. You said you're kind of more concerned about the short term as well, and short term being perhaps even the next decade or the next 4 years. If you could elaborate a little bit on that, and then I'll move to other questions. And please feel free to raise your hand or add questions in the Q&A.
Well, it's funny because I got an email message last night at 11 o'clock It's always, hurry up. So the head of the woman who works is organizing our faction said, I need your top 5 laws for the upcoming fall session. We're now technically in recess, although we never leave the Knesset in recess, all these emergency hearings. But she said, I need your top 5 laws because we have to get it in line for the government ministers committee on legislation. So you have to say what it is, decide now. So I was like, oh my gosh. And indeed, the first law which I'm putting through is a law which involves, I wrote it 5 years ago for another Knesset member and she didn't get it passed and she passed another one. Now I'm going to try to get it passed. And it's requiring the government to make regular monitoring and reporting about biodiversity. I haven't talked about Israel's biodiversity crisis because today's topic is, but if you want to be equally depressed about the state of the world, we have a serious problem. We're hemorrhaging species, largely due to the fragmentation of habitat. And Israel being a crowded country is a prime example. And so I'm working very hard on that issue as one, which I think is one that we have just a short window. If we don't do something to stem the tide, we'll find ourselves with a lot fewer species. Israel has 112 natural mammal species, but about a third of all the vertebrates are in danger of extinction. So we need to change that. And I'm involved in a lot of specific things. This morning I was in Haifa trying to do something with some rivers there to bring back some rare species, but I think that whole issue is one that is extremely important to me. But I would make for the point, even though this is a talk with an environmental focus, there are 2 other flags. 60% of my time I put into sustainability issues, many of which we've discussed sort of tonight, population, climate, whatever. But the other 2 issues that I'm more interested in is the issue of the status of women in Israel. I am disappointed with progress. Israeli women certainly have a better access to opportunities than, say, most women in the Middle East, but we could be doing much, much better when you look at the wage gap, when you look at even just the number of women in the Knesset, which is still it's not 50% like Scandinavia, like it should be. And many other areas we saw during the Corona shutdowns and lockdowns. We were locked down for a long time. There was a rise in domestic violence. A lot of things made me very concerned and realizing if these remain only as women's issues, we're not going to make progress. And so I'm just taking it on. I'm not an expert, but I'm getting a lot of help from women's NGOs, which is a good opportunity to say those people who are interested in come sticking around for the discussion about internships. I know a lot more NGOs in the women's movement than I did, say, 2.5 months ago when I started this thing, because they just are amazing educators for me. The third issue, which I think is extremely important, is religious pluralism. And Israel has taken some steps backward, I think, in terms of the extremism which was allowed when the ultra-Orthodox had such political influence in Israel's government. And now that they're not there, I think we can do something. So the second law on my list of 5 is a law which would implement what we call the Western Wall arrangement, offering a egalitarian section of this ancient wall from, I guess, from Solomon's temple. Actually, it's probably more from Herod's time, the actual wall, which would be allowed for non-Orthodox people who want to pray, men and women equally together. And that's something which the government had agreed to do, and they backed off. And I think we need to push them, not even gently, from the parliament, and I'm going to put that in. So that's another thing which I think that's the kind of thing we need to increase the harmony or return the goodwill between Israel and so many of the Jewish communities around the world who are not Orthodox and felt a little bit excluded by the government policies. And I think as somebody who's very, very finds themselves very religious but not Orthodox, very involved in the conservative Jewish world, but also have some of my best friend of reform, and I think we need to offer more space and in the public sphere, in the policy sphere. In fact, I just was today lobbying the Economics Committee to put a little more 6 million shekels so that maybe some conservative and reform rabbis might be able to get salaries from the government, not just Orthodox rabbis. So there's things I can do, and I hope that I can open up religious pluralism in Israel and produce a country which is more committed to freedom of belief and religion.
Well, we wish you the best of success in all those efforts. There was a question in the Q&A regarding a New York Times expose of something that has not really been all that secret, and I don't think, or ambiguous in the past few years about Israel killing nuclear scientists in Iran, and other such policies. So a question that's not geared to the environment. And let me just read you a couple related to that. James Wagman asks, is it possible that Iran will use its nuclear program for peaceful purposes to reduce its carbon footprint, or is it purely military? And he also asked, this is something I don't know much about, but it would be possible to implement volcanic eruptions in order to cool the planet. The nightmare scenario of this was the nuclear winter doomsday forecast of Carl Sagan. Can this be done on a limited basis without catastrophic results? So two different issues, but all dealing with Iran. Yeah.
Sort of notion of climate engineering that we can release particles in the atmosphere and maybe reduce a little bit of the increase. The problem with that is that it creates a dependence in the long term. You have to do that for the rest of history, because once you stop doing, the temperatures will go right back to what they would have been if you just say, oh, we're going to put up the. So I think that's a really bad idea, and I think it hasn't been shown to be strongly. I won't, although now that I'm a politician, I should cough politely and say, next question after the Iran, but I'll speak frankly about Iran. Iran constitutes the single greatest threat to stability in the region. They have proven time and again that they are much more committed to promoting their own Shiite radical Islamic agenda than they are to providing for the basic needs of their citizens who go starving or have faced great economic hardship while they export an agenda of terrorism to Israel's neighbors and attack those values and countries who are moderate in the region. And I believe that the nuclearization of Iran constitutes an existential threat to Israel for sure, but I would also argue for America. I don't think the Iranians would bat an eye about sending a dirty bomb in a suitcase and letting it go in Washington. They're fanatical. And if you read what they say, I think every effort to prevent that is morally justified. And if it requires unorthodox tactics by Israelis, then that's what it's going to require. And I wish that more countries did more to reduce this threat. And I feel it's tragic for the Iranian people because they have extremist Islamic leadership. But we need to recognize that threat for what it is. And they have been exporting this agenda in very real terms and supporting the kind of Islamic jihad terrorism that makes everybody, I think, sleep poorly at night. So I'm support my own party's, our party's in charge of the defense ministry, the efforts to reduce that risk of a nuclear future for Iran. And I appreciate very much President Biden's solemn commitment in the meeting in the White House in front of the cameras with Biden, where he said, no, we will not allow Iran to attain a nuclear capability, have a nuclear bomb. Coming from the President of the United States, that made me feel much better. Nothing moderate about that. I'm hardcore on that issue. I think we all need to be. Yael, please, Yael, turn on your microphone.
Yeah, I think we have take a question from my husband, Eric Aronoff, next, MSU faculty, and then an MSU student, Troy Disselroth, has a question, and maybe we'll unmute you, Troy, after Eric, and you can ask your question. Okay, thanks.
Eric, we'll need a microphone if you're gonna.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Okay, good to see you. Good to see you. Shana tova. I have a question that will take us back, I think, to the environment. I was intrigued, and this may be kind of tangential to the larger, strokes of your talk, but you mentioned the retooling of the national water carrier to carry water, desalinated water back to the Canaanite. And then later you also talked about the Dead Canal project. And that kind of struck me as interesting in that, the essential question I wanted to ask was, what are the energy costs of that kind of project? Because, from your book, Pollution in the Promised Land, you kind of look back at the National Water Carrier project as an example from the 50s and 60s of, massive engineering projects to alter the environment that then decades later we look back on, like the draining of the Hula and places like that as maybe not mistakes, but leading to unforeseen environmental consequences later on. So to hear that kind of retooling, and then the picture you showed of not just kind of using the carrier and reversing the flow, but actually lots of new construction, yeah, I guess, what are the energy costs for that? And is that a kind of continuation of that tradition of trying, massive engineering projects to solve environmental issues that then have their own environmental impacts and costs?
So I'm very happy afterwards to send you an article where a postdoc of mine, I wrote an article exactly about this, about the carbon footprint of Israel as environmental research letters. We were thrilled to get it in such a good journal. But we reckon that to provide all of Israel's desalination for the future, we would need an area about 5 times the size of Tel Aviv, I think, for solar panels. Today, energy to power the water system is about 3 to 4%. If I remember the percentage right, although I should go back but it's not insignificant, but it's not unbelievable. So my sense would be is, yes, if we were to expand our water export to Jordan dramatically, we should, if nothing else, for security reasons, because if the agricultural community starts to collapse in Jordan like it did in Syria, we could have just a serious situation. We don't need that on our eastern border. So we need to really provide them with that water, but we need to do it with a new electricity system, which is designed based on renewable energy. I'm very hopeful that certain technologies, for example, building solar capabilities inside of windows and on the side of buildings could be part of this. There's all sorts of things we should be doing in terms of improving our renewable energy capacity, which would make this possible. So yes, you're right. It would be prodigious amounts of new energy. And again, every year, 2% more Israelis, 2% more electricity, all this kind of stuff. So we're going to be growing anyway. We just have to make sure that it's renewable and solar or wind, maybe. I'm kind of looking in the possibility of winds in the sea, actually, using rafts.
Great. Thank you very much. I have another question, but I'll get back in the queue.
Troy.
Okay, good.
Hi, I don't know if you can see me or not, but hi, Professor. Thanks for the talk. Oh, okay, one second.
There you go.
Okay, there we are.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thanks so much for the talk. Climate justice is a big part of the organizing that I do in the U.S. actually with the Sunrise Movement, and so I really loved seeing that this is an issue that you care about. One concern that we're dealing with here is that even if we are able to implement progressive policies to tackle climate change, that the unintended consequences of that may be a large overuse of eminent domain and land seizure by the government that could end up targeting particularly indigenous communities in the US. So the question I put in the Q&A was just, as a lawmaker in Israel, do you see eminent domain as being a part of the solution on climate? And if so, how do you ensure that the government's acquisition of that land to promote climate justice doesn't also perpetuate environmental injustice?
Wow. Terrific question. Terrific. I would start by saying that there are some interesting similarities. At first I said, nah, it's not relevant. As you went on, I said, because as we will discuss in class on Monday, tomorrow, the issue of the Bedouins and the Bedouin land claims is very complicated. This is a nomadic peoples who can't show that they were really owning any land because they moved about, but they claim that they have these historic lands, and the government says no, and those lands should be nature reserves. We need them for militaries, and there's a big battle over that. And a very innovative, actually American Israeli by the name of Yosef Abramovich has been really advocating, let's work with these communities and create solar farms there where they'll have economic benefits. But the difference between the scenario which you describe is that the ownership of the means of production would belong to these communities. So it would be an economic boom to the people, the weakest link in the Israeli community. And it wouldn't be, hopefully, a wealthy, energy company coming in and taking these people's lands essentially by doing that. The issue of climate justice is real in the world, and in most places, the poorer people they tend to have a lower carbon footprint. We did some research on that. In some cases, that's not exactly true within Israel, but on the whole, it's a pretty fair thing that the more affluent countries have had historically a predominant influence, and yet the people who are paying the price in terms of the small island nations that are being overwrought by higher, sea levels, and what's happening in Bangladesh and all the drought areas are poor countries. So we really need to recognize that there is this $100 billion climate fund, which was supposed to be created out of Paris, which not everybody's pointed up. I mean, the United States didn't pay up during the Trump years. Hopefully they'll come in there. That would buy part of the solution, but probably not all of it. But on the other hand, if we tell the developing countries, well, you didn't really have anything to do historically with most of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, so you're off the hook, they'll be the losers. We're not doing them any favors. So we have to find ways to assist them. And many of them say, don't help us with climate change, just give us money or give us, help with food, whatever. We have to find ways to engage them. And I would argue, not this book, but the previous book I wrote was about agro-technology and agribusiness in Israel. And what I learned was, while I wrote the book, is that the real game changer, I believe, in terms of transforming the African economy for smallholders, which is the majority of African people, small farmers, is giving them solar capabilities. Because once they have that electricity, they can run their refrigeration, which means they don't have to sell their tomatoes immediately. They can actually store it in whatever they're having. They can have some kind of an irrigation system, start using drip irrigation, which is so critical in these warm areas. They have an opportunity to send their kids. I mean, there's all kinds of things. They have electricity at night, means they can read at night, which means they can come computers, the internet, all this kind of stuff. So the solar potential for transformation, particularly in Africa, is huge. And I'm really hopeful that we never lose sight of that, and we can help them leapfrog beyond the heavy and not have to go through the coal polluted stage in most places, but to do better. But it's a complicated issue. I'll be happy to chat maybe during office hours about your work. I didn't realize you were a climate advocate. Well done.
Great. Thank you for that answer.
Eric, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm back up.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, that actually maybe leads to my next question, which was if you could go back to the general's report about climate change as being a security threat to Israel. What were their recommendations, other than perhaps the predictable kind of using water, as in with Jordan, as a kind of a tool for cooperation? What were their recommendations following on that report?
It's an anthology, so everybody took it in somewhat different directions. But some of the things, first of all, there's the adaptation side of it. The Israeli military has to realize that there's problems with training in a country which is that hot, and there has to be dealing with those kind of issues. But I think mostly we're talking about looking for ways that climate could be destabilizing in those regimes which we've come to rely on. And it's complicated because our new friends are heavy into the oil business. I'll give you an example of a present dilemma. It's not actually answering your question, but there is this pipeline that now it's called the Europe-Asia pipeline, but it starts in Eilat and goes all the way to Ashkelon, takes all this oil. Every year, about 5 or 6 different oil tankers come and dump off their 250,000 tons of oil, and then it skips going into the Suez Canal and goes through the Mediterranean. As part of the Abraham Accords, which is important for us security-wise, because we have a major, very wealthy country that's willing to be our pal. There was a company there that says, we would like to save that money. Let's bring 70 oil tankers from the United Arab Emirates, drop off the oil in Eilat and send up to Ashkelon. Okay, that's a good thing. However, it creates also a target. And we know, for example, there was a massive oil spill off of the Mediterranean coast just about 4 or 5 months ago, and it's still covered with tar, and it's heartbreaking. We're down there trying to clean up, and it's almost impossible. And that was a teeny weeny spill. That wasn't a 250. So if any of these ones should be sabotaged, or even if there was just an accident, and we all know from the Exxon Valdez and the British Petroleum and the all these kinds of things, that there are accidents all the time, and bringing in 70 tankers means that in a little bit of a spill in Eilat, there went the coral reef, there went the tourist industry. So those are connected to security or international relations in the region, but it's also, and I really believe that, I've been very strong advocating Israel's canceling, the government canceling this agreement, trying to convince my defense minister about this, wrote him a memo that I sent off this morning actually on this issue. And he's going to hopefully look it over because it's complicated. But there are defensive measures because Israel needs to have the ability to take in oil, not just in Ashkelon, because of the concern that Gaza is right next to where we take in most of our oil from the Mediterranean Sea. And it's a very, very hostile border with a very, very hostile Hamas government. So there's a lot of areas where it could be in there. But there was some talk about translating the book, and I'll see where that's at because I think I can send you my chapter. I already translated it, and there's a few chapters which are excellent. One of the authors of one of the chapters, the co-authors, was a guy named Mike Herzog, who is the brother of the president and now the new ambassador to Washington. And he was writing about climate change. And so you have a very articulate and smart person thinking about security. I think he's a former colonel in intelligence or something, and the climate connection.
Thank you.
I think I only saw one other question right now. So if anybody has a question, please raise their hand or put it in the Q&A. But there was a question from Mark Bernstein in terms of why Israel pays any rabbis out of government salaries, because you were saying in your effort to get Israel to be more, to embrace religious pluralism in terms of Judaism, that they should also pay Reform and conservative rabbis. So I don't know if you'd like to answer that. Yeah.
Mark, and maybe in a perfect world, Israel would adopt a separation of church and state kind of policy comparable to the US. I could see advantages and disadvantages, but the reality is that's not going to happen anytime in the foreseeable future. So now you have a situation where Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox rabbis are bankrolled and subsidized and assisted, and those people who would rather have a different expression of Judaism are not. Under those conditions, and now we've had, we went to the Supreme Court and they said, okay, you should do those. So 2.5 million shekels given through the Ministry of Culture and Sport to, in rural areas of certain kinds of non-Orthodox rabbis. And that, if you're gonna do it, I want parity. So I'm willing to discuss the issue of separation of church and state, but until that's something that could be seriously discussed on the national agenda, there are a few parties who might even be willing to consider it. But until that happens, I would like to see all different perspectives with equal access to resources. I think it would be to the benefit of the country and freedom there. So that would be my answer. Ayala, maybe we should sort of wrap it up then if it's.
Yeah, I think so. We'll see if you have any kind of closing remarks, but other than that, I think you've addressed many issues, both the urgency of them and some of the possible solutions. And I just want to also remind those, so once you give you a chance to make a couple closing remarks, if you'd like, that those of you who'd like to, we take a 5-minute break, and those who would like to stay on to learn about internship opportunities in Israel, Alon Tal is one of the best sources to give you lots of ideas, and he has lots of connections to help students as well, and is always happy to help students and has done so in the past. And again, we have scholarships that can cover student expenses while they're doing their student internships and flights and things like that. So I don't know if you have any closing remarks, and otherwise we'll take a 5-minute break, and those who'd like to stay on can do so.
Well, I think I'd like to take a break from my roles as an academic or scholar and just speak from the heart a little bit. Look, climate change is way too serious to leave it as a spectator sport. We need players and actors. And so I'm so glad to find out that one of my students is a climate activist. But even if you don't feel like being a climate activist, everybody is part of the problem. And so when you look at your life, and we're in a period now, those who look at the Jewish calendar, a period of introspection and trying to figure what we can do better as people, try to figure out how you can lower your carbon footprint. It could be maybe you can do some of those things. Maybe you can eat a little bit less beef, or maybe you can buy an electric car, or there's all kinds of things that you need to might consider so that you can feel like you're part of the solution and not part of the problem. We're gonna need everybody. It's a complicated issue. And we're all, it's easy to be self-righteous, but I think if we realize that we have a crisis, but that just the same way that, when America was at war in World War II, everybody got together and made the effort to overcome it and transform the economy and do what needed to be done to win that battle. This is a war that can be won. It's a war with ourselves. It's a global effort, and we can all be part of the solution. Hopefully in Israel, we're doing more to be part of the solution than we have in the past. So that will be it. And I'll see everybody in 3 minutes, maybe. How about that?
Great.